Welcome back. Let's get into part two. Okay, so in the first part of this, I talked a lot about the developing brain, a little bit of the science about what's actually happening when this infant's mind's being constructed, and this interaction between genetics and the social world. In this second part, I hope you find it interesting. We're going to look a little bit more at the sensory development, especially starting with topics around vision. All right, welcome. And I'll try to be concise and a bit shorter with this second part. All right, cheers. All right, this is an awesome. This is an awesome first slide to get into because this is the age-old distinction um, between sensation and perception, right? So like this idea that, let me just get it up there for you. One way I like to describe this to students is that, say if I was doing a lecture to you in person and we're in a classroom and I'm at the front of the classroom talking about something and there was a camera recording me, and everyone would agree maybe that I was wearing a black shirt, I said certain words. It's like you all, to a certain extent, heard what I was saying, saw me the same way, hopefully didn't smell me. I'm trying to think of what other senses. Probably just mainly visual and audio. But some of you might have found it like super interesting. Some of you might. We could even use this video since it actually is a video and it's a more obvious example. It's like this video is a certain length. I say certain things. You're all seeing the same video, but you're all perceiving it slightly differently. Some of you might find it interesting. Some of you might just be like, just get on with it. I just need to hear the thing so I can like pass the test, get the class. Like enough of this bald guy's rants. But the idea that there could be multiple of you responding to it differently is just par for the course. That's just how it is. But what does that really mean? Because you're all responding differently to the same similar sensation, right? But again, even that's not, you're not, it's so complicated. Sensation and perception stand right beside each other. It's like sensation is when information interacts with our sense receptors. That's specifically what it is. When information enters through the eyes, the ears, the taste buds, the nose, or the sense of touch. Our evaluation of that information is our perception, our interpretation of those senses. Sensation occurs when information interacts with our receptors, the eyes, the ears, the tongue, the nostrils, the skin. The sensation of hearing occurs when waves of pulsating air are collected by the outer ear and transmitted through the bones of the inner ear to the auditory nerve. The sensation of vision occurs when rays of light contact the eye, become focused on the retina, and are transmitted by the optic nerve to the visual centers of the brain. I'm obviously reading this. Perception is the interpretation of what you just sensed. The airwaves that can contact the ear might be interpreted as noise or as music, right? So you could be like, oh, that's terrible, or that's awesome. The physical energy transmitted to the retina of the eye might be interpreted as a certain color or pattern or shape, depending on how it's perceived. Perception brings us into contact with our environment in order to interact and adapt to it. Interact with it and adapt to it. So it's this idea of we're not just like walking around with cameras and like audio recorders and like, whatever. We're actually bringing in information and interpreting it and making value judgments. Even, I say on the screen there, even infants display visual preferences. Infants will look at more attractive faces more. Infants will look at human faces over pictures of human faces over pictures of different animals. So they're like liking some things more than other things, right? Which is like basically just this trying to say that like perceptions are there right from the beginning. You have a perception of your sensation. Okay, so check out this. And I thought that this image, that last slide, if you're noticing, if you're following along with the PowerPoint, you notice I skipped a slide that basically was just talking about how the baby tends to preference new stimulus. And I just realized it sort of overlaps with a thing I'm going to talk about later. So I just, usually if I drop a slide, just don't focus on that one. So actually, I'll probably remember to just take it out, so don't worry about it. The visual acuity, I should start this slide over again with all that rambling. But anyways, visual acuity is this idea of like how clear it is, how much acuity there is. So like, for example, the picture on the right has much higher visual acuity than the picture on the left. So these 4 photographs represent a computer estimation of what a picture of a face would look like to a 1-month-old, 2-month-old, 3-month-old. And then notice how by like 3 months, the coloration is all wrong. It's more shadowy than it should be. There's all that, but you could recognize that person. Now, by the time it's a year old, the baby basically is 20/20. Using this visual preference method, so using like visual preference method is just like they study like what the baby's looking more at, and you can tell that if it's looking more at something, it's sort of evidence that it can tell the difference between things, right? If it's looking more over here than over here, it's probably for a reason, and the reason is probably because it likes what it's seeing more over here, because you can't ask a baby what it sees, right? So you almost have to imply based on their behavior. So using this visual preference method, we estimate that a newborn's vision is about 2600. So this would mean that a baby can clearly see from 20 feet what you, if you had perfect vision, could see from 600 feet. That's what 2600 means, that they could see from 20 feet what you with perfect vision could see from 600 feet. So not very good. 20/20 means that, you know, we could both see the same from 20 feet. That by the end of the first year of life, the baby's basically at 20/20. By 6 months, the baby's at like 20/40, so like halfway there. So again, like this, I think this is interesting that there's so much, it seems, emphasis on the development of the visual system. And then you think about why. Well, it's because that's so connected to the baby's ability to like literally see the world. All right. Okay, before I explain this slide, I want to just explain the word habituation, or getting used to it, right? It's like the birds, the crows in this example, it's like the crows are just eating in the field. So the farmer puts a scarecrow to scare the birds, and it works for a bit, but then they get used to it. They're used to it being there. They're habituated. It's become like normalized. And like one thing is that sometimes babies don't show the preferences you think that they would show. They're not looking at maybe what you think that they would look at. And is it because they're not noticing, or is it because things have just got normal and they're only looking at like new stuff? So there's kind of 2 broad explanations for when babies fail to show a visual preference. One of the explanations is maybe they don't know the difference, right? Maybe it's actually their eyes aren't like noticing or discriminating between the two. The other is that they don't prefer one over the other. To measure discrimination, researchers use a habituation paradigm. So what they basically do is during this part of the experiment, the habituation phase, they'll show the baby a sight or a sound that's presented a number of times until the baby kind of starts to get bored of it and starts looking at it less. And the fact that it's looking at it less kind of shows that they're getting used to it, that they're actually, habituation indicates that the baby is no longer interested in the new stimulus. If the researcher now presents a new picture and the infant can notice that it's a new picture, you would think that it would like be interested again, that the infant's response will recover. The recovery of a habituated response after a change in a situation is called habituation. So it's like the baby got used to seeing the same thing, and now it's something new, so it's not that, and that gets its attention again. It's almost like it's like a way of talking about visual novelty. Oh, it does a countdown for each slide. I timed that wrong. Usually try to get camera sips or coffee sips off camera. Um, I want to explain this to you. Okay, so this is called a visual cliff experiment. So if you picture this, if you just look at the picture on the screen, you see that there's like a kid on top of what looks like a table. The one side of the table is like checkerboard. And then you see that the other side of the table, the checkerboard's lower on the ground, and there's like glass over the top. So the baby's not gonna fall, but it's supposed to look like it might fall. And this is because what I was saying on the last slide, you can't obviously ask a baby what it sees. So what they're trying to do is, if the baby, because this is about depth perception, if the baby looks over the side and doesn't want to go over that line, you would assume that the baby is thinking it might fall. It's perceiving the depth, right? Depth perception. It's perceiving that the checkerboard is lower once it gets to a certain point. If the baby just crawls apart, then you sort of would assume it doesn't. So this is what it's saying. I mean, it's like it's a visual cliff. It's not an actual cliff. The visual cliff experiment. In the seminal study, Eleanor Gibson and Richard Walk in 1960 constructed the visual cliff. They did this by creating two levels of a checkerboard pattern, one at the height of a table and the other at the height of the floor. The drop-off was covered by glass, so it was safe for babies to crawl off the visual cliff. They would place 6 to 12-month-year-old, so basically like a half a year to a year-old infants on the edge of the visual cliff, and then they'd have their moms go to the other side and basically try to coax them. So like basically just saying, "Come here, come here, come here." Most of the infants would not crawl on the glass. So think about that. Let me say that sentence again. I have it written in my note in capitals and I kind of stumbled through saying it. Most of the infants would not crawl on the glass, choosing to stay on the safe side, an indication that they could. Why? Well, because they thought they were going to fall. They could perceive depth. Right? So it's trying to set up this is interesting because it's trying to set up an experiment to test what the visual perception or experience, like what is your experience then? That's like a hard word to then throw into that mix. It's like your experience is some kind of combination of your sensation and your perception bound in time. Okay. I won't go on a rant about COVID here, but like from a developmental psychology perspective, facial recognition and facial information processing is so core to baby brain development. I don't know how like comfortable people are with me talking about like things related to the last few years, but like I don't know. I had a baby during that time. I paid a lot of attention to making sure that baby saw people's full faces because so much of the early brain development is and emotional intelligence is based on developing an ability to read physical cues and that people communicate, right? We call it nonverbal communication. Remember I said when we were kids, we always heard 90% of information is nonverbal. 90% of communication is nonverbal. What does that actually mean? It means that it's not just the words, it's the physical emotional expressions associated with it. The baby's not looking at random places. Within hours of birth, the baby's looking specifically at faces. It's prioritizing ones it finds attractive. It's, when I say something there, it's like I say upright. So basically, just to finish my point from before, it's like one of my worries is the the law of unintended consequences, it's like we probably interfered with a lot of social skill development, obviously. Like, that's like, in a way, that's like, I couldn't say a more obvious sentence, but that's a major, major issue. Okay, so anyways, babies don't fully recognize faces like adults do yet, but they have this ability to start to recognize things. So for example, if you show them pictures of faces that I say upright versus inverted, which just means like, if you show them a picture of their mom and one's upside down and one's the right way, sort of, they'll look more at the one that's the right way. So they'll look more at a human's face than a different animal. They'll look more, the more the person looks like them too, the more they'll look at that picture. So it's showing that like right away the baby's recognizing and prioritizing the face. And I said this before, I don't have it on this slide, but like, or let me just read this slide actually, because I have an interesting note here. Faces are possibly the most important stimulus in a child's social environment. Let me read that again. Faces are possibly the most important visual stimuli in a child's social environment, and it is important that they extract key information from other people's faces. Infants show an interest in human faces soon after birth. Within hours after being born, research shows that infants prefer to look at the faces than another object, and tend to look at more attractive faces more. So they like some faces more than others. They're Say that the infant is treated. So I was just going to read when sometimes when infants have problems with their eyes early and how that affects social processing, and I have a point I'm going to say about that in a bit. But yeah, I wanted to really kind of stress this point, like the face-to-face piece. It's like babies aren't looking at your shoulder or your elbows; they're looking at the sides of your mouth and your eyes. So I need to switch back into presenter view so I know how much to put up. Okay, so it says their auditory experiences begin within the last 2 months of pregnancy. So, and I want to kind of make the point to you that that doesn't mean that sound didn't get in earlier. It means what it means is that the auditory system wasn't developed enough to process sound until the last 2 months. So it's kind of interesting, right? It's like the reason why it's more sensitive in the last 2 months is because it has the ability to be. Immediately after birth, infants struggle more with softer sounds. They do better with louder sounds, and that's kind of obvious. It'd be weird if it was the opposite. By 3 months of age, infants' perception of sound improves, although some aspects of perception don't reach full adult levels until 5 or 10 years of age. For example, they're not as good at like telling what side where a sound came from. Excuse me, I have the hiccups a little bit. Infants are also less sensitive to the pitch of a sound. Pitch is the frequency. Infants are less sensitive to low pitch and are more likely to hear higher pitch. By age 2, infants are considerably improved in their ability to distinguish sounds, and by 2 years they start to get better at being able to locate where a sound's coming from, something that you're actually, as an adult, really good at, unless you have a specific like issue with hearing. All right, I like this term and concept. I find it interesting and also like, I don't know, fun to talk about how if you if your grandma makes apple pie, a delicious apple pie, and you think about that apple pie, that, well, now I'm talking about it as a memory. Let's see, you see that apple pie in real life. You sit down at the table, and it's like you don't just smell it and see it and taste it. It's all kind of combined into your experience, that your perception of it almost is combining these sensory components. That intermodal, that just means when it's not just your vision or your hearing or your taste, it's them combined, like interaction, intermodal, intermodes, the different modes of your senses, your eyes, your ears, your taste. Intermodal means the connection between those, that they get integrated, the sound and the taste get integrated. I almost started this example talking about a memory of that, because that's how memories are stored too. They're stored intermodal. Your memory of that piece of dessert that your grandma makes combines your image of your grandma and your image of the dessert and the smell of it, maybe, and the taste of it, maybe even the sensation of eating it. So intermodal means this connection across sensations. That actually, one of the most interesting things is that oftentimes you walk into a room and you see, hear, smell, like all those things are happening at the same time, and they're being processed oftentimes as like a package. Intermodally would be the word, in an intermodal way. And this, I say here, like this intermodal perception facilitates learning in infancy. Most perception is intermodal. There's a lot of redundant information in the world, so there's a lot of repetitive information, but this redundancy plays an important role in because the baby's constantly trying to make sense of their world. Yeah, so basically the point I want you to have is just this idea that the senses, and you know this, right? Like if you're at a concert, you're not like, oh, I'm gonna like look for a bit, then I'm gonna listen for a bit, and then I'm gonna look for a bit, and then I'm gonna smell for a bit. It's like it's all just like happening at the same time. That was a weird example, but your perception of the world is intermodal. So if you've been exposed to Piaget, you've heard this idea of schemas, and if you haven't, it's basically just this idea that he thought that we develop schemes or schemas. We develop these maps of the world, and as we go through our life, we're constantly, he said, assimilating and accommodating. Assimilating means we're trying to play out our map. We know how we're supposed to act in this situation. In this situation, we know how we're supposed to do this. And sometimes things work, and we try to kind of make sense. It's almost like we have a game plan. Kids go through use their game plan to try to make sense of their world. That's another way of saying children use their existing schemas to deal with new information. Think of your schemas as your game plan. But then sometimes things don't work, and there needs to be an accommodation to that plan. So Piaget thought that adapting to an environment was basically you assimilating and accommodating, you trying out your plan, seeing where it needs to be adapted, and making tweaks. And again, it's not like you're aware you're doing this. It's like he'd say this is what learning is. This is what social skill is. Social skill is the kid going and wanting to play with the people at the park, and because at home they can boss around their little sister, they try to say, like at the park, well, everyone has to play the game I want. The kid's saying, well, forget you then, and going and playing without them, and them having to be like, okay, well, I guess I can't do that. I have to accommodate. I need to change my game plan and try again. And then maybe that works. And so now that becomes more of a, maybe now you go and you realize that to actually be a fun person to play with, you join the game. You don't demand them switch to your game immediately, which is something kids struggle with. But this idea of assimilation and accommodation, I think you can think of it as almost as simple as assimilation is just Piaget's word for you're not going into the world and acting randomly. You have ideas of how you're supposed to act in different situations, and you tried those out. And sometimes the feedback you get makes you accommodate or change your plan, and then you're like constantly adapting this model in your mind of the world and of your place in it. It's kind of complicated, but Piaget's a complicated guy. He's the most important developmental psychologist. And the idea is that kids build these schemes to organize their knowledge so that everything's not just random facts. They actually are kind of building a model of the world. So Piaget is actually a brilliant person, and he had this idea that the brain changes through this process of recombination and assimilation, but also that there is these jumps in knowledge. And well, I'll explain this a lot in a later presentation, but Piaget is an interesting person because he was working with a guy named Simon was the last name. And then the other person, Simon Binet IQ test is like the main Stanford IQ test. It's like the most official IQ test. Simon Binet, the Simon last name is the name of a person that was involved in creating the IQ test, and Piaget worked for him, and his job was to study the wrong answers that people gave, and he started to notice that kids gave wrong answers in a way that was somewhat predictable based on how old they were, almost like kids of different ages were analyzing the questions differently, using different things to make their decisions. And he saw this as existing at different stages. This was one of the ideas behind his ideas, that like a 4-year-old's not just a dumber 8-year-old, that actually they're thinking and processing the world in these different stages of cognitive development. Okay, so let's look at this for a sec. This is an idea that it took me like teaching this class for quite a long time to actually get how deep the term sensory motor is. And it almost, to be honest, took me having kids myself and seeing how much of, say, my baby Charlotte's world, even now, because she's this, they say birth to 2, but she's a little bit over 2. How much of her world is like what she sees, what she touches with her hands and plays with, what she hears, that like her senses, sensory, and then her movement and her desire to move around. And like Piaget is saying that the 0 to 2-year-old is closer to in like a dream world where their experience, they're not processing it through this like thought moderator like we are as adults, that their experience again is more like dreamlike. And he used this word sensory motor, that their whole stage of making sense of their world is based largely on their sensory input combined with their desire to move, motor. That infants construct an understanding of their world by this coordinating sensory experiences with physical. They want to get to that thing over there. They try to move to get that thing. It's like that dynamic system idea. But that how they're processing their world is mainly this combination of the sensory processing they're doing and the processing related to figuring out how to move. According to Piaget, the crowning achievement is object permanence. So I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but object permanence is basically this idea that objects are permanent, right? Like you're all adults, you don't wonder if this room I'm in exists between classes, right? That like if you don't see me for a week, you're not wondering if like this microphone still exists. You know that like things in the world are permanent. But now I want you to think about it from, and it's hard to because you can't think backwards in stages, but if you try to visualize what it would be like for a child, the child's not playing everything off that same memory system as you. It's like they're way more in the moment. It's why peekaboo works, because it's like I'm coming in and out of existence. Once a kid gets a certain age, they just pull your hands down. They're like, because they realize like you're just behind the hands. But to the little baby, you're coming in and out of their world. They're like so in the moment. Their entire experience is sensory motor. And so once peekaboo doesn't work on someone anymore, we would basically say that it doesn't work because they realize that the object, in this case dad, is permanent. It's not coming in and out of existence just because you can't see it. And that understanding that things exist that even that aren't within your immediate surrounding, which isn't as obvious as you would assume it is. You only know that because you know that. It wouldn't be obvious to a baby that it actually lives in this super complex world, and people are like going to work during the day and doing this, and that's why they're coming in and out, and it's like the whole story behind everything isn't existing. Everything's sensory motor. It's movement and sensation based. So the next little rant I want to go on, if you could have just these 3 ideas, right? That part of this is the baby's learning or conditioning, that the baby's learning that certain types of behaviors, like say smiling, tend to get positive responses, and that is true, that like babies that smile more tend to get more positive responses, or that when they cry, and so there's this conditioning, this learning that the infant's behavior that's followed by a reward is more likely to reoccur, right? That's just like basic conditioning, operant conditioning, like Skinner. Now, one of the biggest things, this idea of attention, that part of what we're talking about is when we're saying how the baby's getting smarter, some of it is that it's starting to learn. This is associated with this. This is associated with this like conditioning idea. Part of it is that they're developing attention, right? If you look at like how a grade 2 performs on something and how a grade 4 performs on something, and the grade 4 does better than the grade 2, it's not necessarily that they're smarter. It might be just that they pay attention better. Because if you pay attention better than you normally do, you'll perform as if you're smarter. Attention is one of the most important cognitive attributes. It's like, what are you paying attention to? Literally means, what are you focusing your brain resources on? And your ability to do that is directly related to your ability to successfully, complete your task or do the thing you're trying to do. And this is what joint attention means. Joint attention means I'm pointing at a book and reading it to my 2-year-old, and she's following along, and we're laughing at the same picture. We're both, joint means like there's 2 people, and attention meaning we're both paying attention to the same thing. And so I don't have a definition of it there, but you could just put, I have a slide coming up about joint attention in a second, but you could put that joint attention just means like paying attention to the same thing as someone else on purpose, right? Like if you're sitting here watching this with a friend, you're both in the class and you're both watching this and paying attention to the same thing, I would say that that's a demonstration of joint attention. Me reading to my kid and her like watching the book and us like kind of interacting over it, that's joint attention. And yeah, so I say there are differences in things like attention, especially joint attention during infancy is actually predictive. It's related to cognitive development later. And that sort of makes sense, right? That of course your ability to pay attention and your ability to learn are connected. Right? It's like, how much are you focusing your intellect on something? Because you're always paying attention to something, right? If you're daydreaming while I'm talking now, you're just paying attention to your daydream. You are constantly aiming your mental computer at things. It's like, but how much control do you have over that? How much discipline do you have over that? And again, I know I'm talking about infants, but some are better than others. And ones that are better at it, it seems to be linked to development of cognitive skill in general. So just to continue this point for a sec, if we're going to say that we're displaying joint attention, what do we need to see, right? We need to see that, so I say there, like the ability to track each other's behavior. Like I can see that my kid is looking at the same book I'm reading, and that when I'm pointing at, she's saying like tiger, and like we're looking at the same tiger on the book. And she's pointing or I'm pointing, I'm looking at what she's pointing at, or she's looking at what I'm pointing at. Like one person's directing the other person, there's this reciprocal back and forth interaction. So if you break that down, it's like, okay, for me and you to be focused on the same thing, and engaged in this kind of joint attention I'm talking about for infants, it's like they need to be aware that the other person's also paying attention and kind of interacting about the same thing. Right? It's not really the same as just two people watching a TV. It's more like this book example is a better one, like me reading my kid a book. We're both sort of interacting over the book. We're both paying attention to the book. We have joint attention towards the book. I just said that like a million times, but hopefully that made it kind of clear. There's a lot of ways we could talk about memory because memory is super complicated and it includes a whole bunch of things. Like there's the whole how we encode memories and the kind of make memories, and then how they're stored, and then like how we retrieve later. But at the core, memory is how we retain information over time, so that stuff we learn we're not just blank slate randomly going through our world. Our experiences in the past shape how we process the current. And we see that like a 6-month-old can remember information for about a day. By the time the kid's like to about 20 months, they can remember things from the last year, and that's kind of hard to explain because it's not like they can necessarily even talk yet, but you see it in their behavioral. You see the behavioral learning. And this is where we get to the difference between implicit and explicit memory. So now, and this is where I mean like a kid can remember. So some of what they're remembering is like how to do things. It's not necessarily that they remember like going to the beach or something like that. It's that they remember how to spoon feed themselves. They remember how to put their shirt on. They remember how to climb. Some of this is, it's very at the implicit level. Memory without conscious recollection. It's not like they're thinking of events. They're more demonstrating through their learned behavior that they're remembering what they learned. Things like skills and routines. And then so implicit, every time you hear the word implicit, it always means sort of like either inside or under the radar. Explicit, what you see, the more obvious. That's like, so an explicit memory is like I just said, like a memory of like going to the beach, something that's like a specific, like almost stereotypical memory, like almost like you picture it as like a video or a picture or memory of what you did. That's like an explicit memory. But there's also the things you remember how to do that aren't like when you go to do it, you don't remember yourself doing it necessarily. It's at this deeper implicit level. I hope that explanation made sense. I find this topic really interesting. I think I don't really know how to, because there's a certain point of like, you can't, it's the same thing as like any other animal, right? We can assume how like a dolphin would interpret something, but we don't know because we can't straight up ask them. And that's the same thing with humans who haven't developed language yet, right? So like a baby, obviously. And that there's this like, this weird question around this infant amnesia, or the fact that like an easier way to say it is just that we don't remember the beginning of our life. And some of it is that it's a long time ago, but then we have, it's not just time. It seems like almost the way the brain is processing in that sensory motor stage is, it's not storing memories the same way yet. This is one of the reasons why Freud thought that like things that happened early in life had such an effect later, because you're not processing it the same. The effect is more direct and raw. It's not going through the same, your experiences aren't going through the same cognitive filter they're going to go through later. Your experiences are actually creating the cognitive filter that your future experiences are going to go through. Talk about that's a kind of weird rant, but that's, if you found that interesting, that That is what I meant to say. That is a line of thought. So childhood, this idea of infant or childhood amnesia, that most adults don't remember almost anything from the first 3 years of life, probably because the prefrontal lobe is heavily connected to the whole part of like storing memories and stuff, and the prefrontal lobe's development is still immature. So again, we know that the hippocampus is associated with forming new memories, but it seems like the prefrontal lobe, which develops later and is the most high-end part of your brain, seems to play a role in storing the memories. Not necessarily where the memories are, but in where they go. It's almost like they are directing it, the storage. By the end of the second year of life, more long-term memories start to become more substantial and sustainable and reliable. So like, to give you an example of how like a kid is using memory early, it's like, think of my daughter a couple months ago. So let's just because I'm trying to make it the example of her being under 2. And my mom would come over and she knows that that's grandma. So that's like her saying grandma to my mom is evidence that she remembers who my mom is. So sometimes, especially when they can't communicate it yet, you're seeing the behavior as evidence of cognition or likely cognition. You can make informed guesses. Yeah, so anyways, I'm getting a bit rambly, but I think the developing child's mind is so interesting because it's like processing and building, and those two things are interconnected. Now, this is one that's actually pretty. This is maybe an example of something that earlier in my career I would have thought I would have like passed this slide quicker, whereas now I realize that this is actually like a really intriguing thought, that as the baby's getting older, they're getting better at forming concepts. Oh, this person, so grandma comes, once a week, and grandma's daddy's mom, and like all these things are like thoughts, right? Like concepts, these like they're starting to notice things. They're starting to be able to categorize. They're starting to be able to like develop stories to explain things. It's kind of a simple way to define concepts. They're starting to make these cognitive groupings of similar things. Like, these are all my toys. These are all my sister's toys. These are my family members. That they're starting to make, yeah, I'm saying they're cognitive groupings of similar objects or events or people or ideas. And that forming of these infant concepts, or their attempt to create stories that are explaining their experience and what they're seeing and what their world, is actually key to their cognitive development. Without concepts, each object and event would seem unique, right? It would just seem like, oh, there's a butterfly, there's this, there's a person, it's like, it's the narrative that makes things make sense within a story. It's the opposite of everything being random. It's trying to integrate. And so like, I'm not saying, so what I'm saying is that the baby's brain, it's like the baby's brain's designed to try to make sense of its world as a story, not as random things. That's so core to the human experience, and you do it as an adult too. You make sense of your life as a story. Yeah, without stories, I can switch the word, your world would just seem like unique random things. You'd be unable to make any kind of pattern recognitions or generalizations, which is basically recognizing a pattern, that you see it here and here and here and here. So it's not specific to this. It's actually generalized. It's actually specific to all the places. That's what generalized basically means, right? General is basically the opposite of the word specific. Baby, one of the first things it knows is like, these are girls and these are boys, and these are like, the gender distinction is before 2. And so that's an example of a perceptual category, that they're or even just like these are toys, these aren't toys, that categories based on similar features, the brain, one of the first things the brain does is start to figure out how things fit. And if you think of categories as being like, meaning there's toys, then there's food, then there's like whatever, they're starting to like place things, they're starting to construct a more and more and more complicated model of what the world is and what they are. Again, that's always the struggle of life, to understand the world and yourself. So another interesting aspect of development at this stage is like all the stuff regarding language. Now, at its kind of core, language is, I don't know if you find it interesting, but this is like later in the night, right? Like sometimes I record this in multiple sittings, but nice to be back with you. At the core, language is a form of communication based on symbols. Now, some of that's obvious, but it's almost more easy to explain this point by taking like a side example of talking about something like whales, right? We see like humpback whales, they'll have these like long like conversations with each other. They have specific sounds they make for specific whales. That's like pretty close to names. It's like, I think an interesting way to talk about language is to talk about whether or not we think like, say for example, humpbacks are using language, because it forces you to define what language is. If it's making a specific sound that means a specific thing and the other one knows that, that seems to be like a central aspect of what we mean by language. This ability to communicate based on a shared understanding of what a symbol, or like as an example of a symbol could be a sound. It could be a sound or a written. Languages have certain common characteristics, and if you ever heard of a guy named Noam Chomsky who's become, I don't know, was very significant back in time and wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent that was super good and super interesting and super relevant. And he was trying to look at this idea of like, if all languages have a common core and are just different reflections, like is there common principles in all languages? And he basically found that there basically is, and there's certain tribal languages that seem to break some of the rules, but those are more exceptions than disproving the fact that there seems to be a lot of commonality in human language, in how we organize certain things, and in how this idea of infinite generativity, which is just like, again, a fancier way of saying like to generate more sentences. If you write a sentence and I'm like, okay, can you generate another sentence? It's like, can you do it again? Can you do it again, but a bit different? And it's like infinite generativity means I can be talking and I can say a sentence that I've never said before, and I can talk about like a purple elephant playing basketball against a pink giraffe. It's like, I've never said that before, but my brain, like, that's not like, obviously like the thing I'm trying to say that's interesting about language is, or that seems to be a characteristic thing about human language, is this ability to express a wide variety of stuff. It's one of the reasons why an alphabet's so amazing. The development of the alphabet that came mainly from the Phoenicians, and it's the Phoenician alphabets that still has, like, if you looked at it, there'd be letters that would look similar to our alphabet, but just this idea that you have a certain amount of sounds and you can use that to spell any word. An alphabet language is very different than, say, like Chinese Mandarin, where it's like symbol based. It's just not alphabet based. So anyways, it's almost like the mind has like the same kind of quality as the alphabet in the sense of like, or this ability of infinite generativity. Let me explain that better. Okay, because I kind of explained it in a rant, or not a rant, but like sometimes use the word rant, but I mean kind of ramble. So infinite generativity is the ability to produce an endless number of meaningful sentences using a finite amount of words. It's like, it's not like there's a certain amount of words, you know, there's certain rules to your language, but within that exists like all of literature, right? So many different, everything from like comics and comments on Instagram to like the great novels to like textbooks and all that stuff. It's one of the abilities of humans to transmit massive amounts of knowledge between generations. Like we can record our experiences. Yeah, so anyways, part of that is definitely like, so again, what I want you to know from this is basically this concept that like language, what's so interesting about it is it's the ability to, for basically me to pass a message to you. And that exists in different ways. Sometimes it's by like pointing and being like, look over here. Sometimes it's by saying something that you understand. Sometimes it's by drawing something like, I don't know, like you're beating, like if you're going to cross the road and there's a car coming, and I'm like this, it's like you'd kind of know to stop. So that you'd say that's a sign. Okay, next slide. I was going to start to tell another example about how monkeys have sounds that signify the difference between, like they have a warning sound that's associated with hawks and a warning sound that's associated with snakes. And you can take one monkey, a certain type of monkey, I think these are rhesus monkeys they did it with, and expose it, that's never seen a hawk, and expose it to the sound other monkeys make when they see a hawk, and it'll look up. So why does that matter? Because I'm trying to say, like, if there's a difference between the sound that means danger, there's a hawk, and danger, there's a snake, and if that can be communicated across monkeys, then they're basically talking. It's hard to say they're not talking. Even if it's just limited to a few things, right? Okay. It's language. You'll notice with my notes too, I have more notes the more kind of biology based the point is, just because I kind of want to like say it right and make sure, because some of it's just complicated, and if you haven't, like it was a while ago that I really hardcore studied the brain diagrams and stuff like that, right? When I was, but so anyway, so that's why I have a bit more notes in those scenarios. And when it gets to actually the cognitive function and some of the behavioral principles, I'm like just able to kind of go with it a bit more, because I want to kind of stress this point of how this is an evolving skill, and how the baby goes through stages, and that these stages seem to be pretty cross-cultural, meaning that I was saying this actually to my Conestoga students the other day. If you say something's culturally specific, meaning like it's specific to this culture, the opposite of that is to say that it's universal. And what universal means is that basically it's not culturally specific, that it applies to everyone. And even though there's differences across cultures, we see that babies tend to go through these stages of like crying, cooing, which is like kind of like the goo goo gaga kind of stuff, and babbling. And you'll notice that their early sounds that they're making are very vowel specific. And one way I would tell you this that's interesting is like when you talk to a kid and you're like, hi, how are you? How's it going? How's your day going? Hi. It's like, I'm like being so uncreative. I just said hi twice, but notice I'm like, hi. I'm like extending how long I'm saying the I. How? I'm extending the O. I know I sound ridiculous. Are you? I'm like, what I'm trying to say is we start to naturally extend the vowel pronunciations, even if we're not aware that we do it. It's just how adults tend to talk to babies, and what you're actually doing is making it easier for them to understand the word, and you're helping them learn to speak. You're with by saying it like, how are you? Like, I know, like, the extension out of that is highlighting basically the hard part of the word for them. So they're like babbling and doing these cooing, basically like crying is the first auditory sound they make. Obviously the first major vocalization is around like crying and even laughing and like this like kind of cooing, or just like these like early sounds that babies make, like, and then they start to like kind of get into like a babbling, and then they're doing things like pointing. And this is an interesting thing, like sometimes you can teach babies certain sign language earlier than they can talk because they understand before they can vocalize. So like with my baby, what was it? This means more. So if she wants more of something, she would go like this. She'd go like this for a drink. This would mean all done. And that's about it. It's not like we had like a million of them. There's just a few, but even those are pretty good, that she can tell when she's done something and when she wants more of something and when she's thirsty. And as she got older, closer to 2, closer to being able to talk, and now she's like able to talk a bit, but she got to the point where she'd be like, she wanted crackers or something, she would like take my hand and get me to follow her into the kitchen and point and be like, daddy, daddy, daddy. And so now I want you to think about that, because that's actually interesting, because it allows her to communicate to me way above her ability to speak. She's using her understanding of where it is. She's bringing me to the location. She's using her gesturing of pointing, because she knows if she points, I'll look there too. And then she says like my name again to kind of emphasize the thing, right? She can't say, Dad, can you go into the other room and grab me crackers? She has to communicate that, demands this like much more complex approach, right? But it's interesting because they can understand more than they can communicate. So they have this motivation to gesture. My daughter's does it a lot, right? It's a lot of like that baby's picture, right? Pointing at what they want. And actually, that's so much a part of development at that stage. I have that last point, that a lack of pointing is actually like an indication of potentially something to pay attention to, right? Not that you have to necessarily worry about it big time, but it's something to pay attention to. And you might actually worry that they have visual issues if they're not pointing a lot. If they're not like, look at this, look at this, look at this. That's what babies do, right? To them, things are sensory motor, looking and pointing. All right, next slide. So for the people that are studying like the development of language, there's this thing called phonemes, which is, it basically just means like, phonemes means like the sounds that make up words. And so every language would have certain sounds that are made, and certain combinations of those sounds make up words. And so in this person's research named Patricia Kuhl, she's looking at languages from around the world, and she'll play it for infants to hear. She then uses a conditioning opera conditioning to see whether the child can discriminate between different languages. So she'll basically like reward when the child looks towards a certain one. She's basically trying to tell, like, she basically enters a reward with like a candy or whatever. I'm not sure. I haven't looked up what specifically she used as the reward, but she basically has set up a scenario where she plays music and tries to see if like the kid can notice the difference between the languages. A box with a toy bear and it is placed where the infant can see it. A string of identical symbols is played, and periodically the symbols are changed from ba 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 to pa pa pa. So I just have it written like B A B A B A, and then all of a sudden I'll switch to like P A P A P A, and you're looking at, does the kid like look at it as if it like notices a change, like new information? If the infant turns its head when the syllables change, the box will light up and the bear will dance. So that's the reward. I should have just read a bit more there. The reward is that the kid's like, we're trying to get the bear to dance, basically. And if it looks at the thing right, then the bear dances. It's actually a pretty interesting way to set it up. Kuhl's research demonstrated that from birth to about 6 months, infants are citizens of the world, she said, meaning that they can basically tell when there's a change in language almost regardless of what the language is. Wild. But over the next 6 months, infants growing up in a one language environment, monolingual environment, just one language, monolingual, like you've heard the term bilingual, right, to mean two languages. But infants growing up in a monolingual environment get even better at perceiving changes in their own language, the one that their parents are speaking, but they gradually start to lose the ability to differentiate in different languages, which is so interesting that basically babies are good at telling differences and changes in all languages, or at least a variety of languages, but as they get older, at least the languages they tested, as they get older, they get better at the one language, but as they get better at the one language, they lose the ability with the others. Which again is just another example of how amazing the brain is, that the brain's basically so adaptable, it could learn the language of wherever it is. That my child could be raised in, we could have moved to, I think I used this example maybe with this class already, but when I was describing something different, but if I had have moved to like Egypt when Evelyn was born, and her whole life was in Egypt, she would speak Egyptian like completely fluently, and like her brain would have no more problem with that than learning English. Like, isn't that's pretty interesting, right? All right, but as they learn one, they lose the ability to learn others. Yep, pretty interesting. This whole brain thing. It's like it's again. I'm trying to resist using the terms like, because the loaded words in this debate are always created, because that implies like a divine creation, or like even saying it's like designed. Like, what does that even mean? What does it mean to say it's like designed in a fascinating way? But whether you think it's nature or God, again, you're adults, you have your own thoughts. But what's fascinating is just the complexity, like the complexity of language development, and it's like high end cognition in the most high end cognition creature we know of, right? The human brain. It's like one of the most complicated things that we do is the fact that you understand what I'm talking about. Even if I'm on like a weird rant, it's like you're understanding it. And that allows us to transmit, allows me to teach a class from far away and connect with you, right? So anyways, next slide. Segmentation, okay. It's a kind of tough idea, but like I say they're like the real language, or the real challenge in learning language is segmentation, and it's difficult to segment continuous streams of speech into words. How do you actually break up? So like if you're a baby hearing an adult talk and an adult saying all these things, it's like, how do you know which word meant water, which word meant drink, which word meant kitchen, which, like, how do you, because you have to basically, it's a categorization challenge. It's like and the idea is that it's basically through statistical repetition. So like the baby just hears the word water associated with something it drinks so many times that it starts to learn that that's what water is. It's like an association through repetition. So I say that differently there. I say, but the same thing, that babies likely solve this problem of like how to understand which words mean what by relying on like how they're, so I say like the co-occurrence, like where the words usually come. Like people usually say drink before water, or before milk, or before juice. So drink must, so like I'm trying to understand what it means based on when I'm hearing it, what words are around it, the context basically. The babies basically use the context to understand what words mean. And that's one of the hardest things, because they're almost learning what individual words mean by listening to just streams of language. right? That's why like they're just like hearing the people in their world talk. Sometimes with a kid, they're like being directly taught how to talk. Like maybe you're working on with a kid around how to pronounce certain things, but so much of language learning is from exposure. And so part of that is hearing individual words and understanding what individuals, starting to understand what individual words mean and being able to say them. And that infants understand words before they can say them. So this is why like the sign language thing I was talking about, where my daughter can understand the concept of being all done before she can say it. And so an interesting aspect of this is the difference between what's called receptive vocabulary, which means like what the kid can understand, and spoken vocabulary with what they can say. And that there's a difference. I'm going to show you, maybe I have a chart coming up, I'm not sure. But basically it's like a baby can understand a certain amount of words that's big, and even though they can only say certain words. And that's true with everything. That's actually true with you too and me. If you're really into some topic and you're hearing people talk about it at like a really high end that you're just barely understanding, it's like we can all sort of understand more than we could necessarily talk about and describe ourselves. And that's super true with kids, where it's like, especially babies, especially when you're in this stage we're looking at, like infancy, that they can understand more than they can communicate that they can understand. Which again, there's like, I could rant for a long time on that. It's really interesting. On average, infants understand about 50 words by the time they're 13 months, but they're not going to be able to say 50 words for almost another half a year. So that's like an example time-wise between the difference between receptive and spoken vocabulary. Yeah, so it's the first point, the 2 points here. Children often express various intentions with single words. That's like my daughter pointing and being like, water, water. Or just even saying when she was younger, before she could say specific stuff like that. Now she can. Now she would probably just say like daddy water, and just like she'll even like look at me and move, take my face and point it. Remember, she's 2, she's like super cute, but she's like very assertive in her own way. And she'll like, now she can talk more, but it's more relevant to this conversation if I think about her like a few months ago. And she would do that a lot, like single word, or she'd be like upstairs if she wanted to go upstairs, or she'd be side. She'd try to say outside and just say side. That means to go outside. So she wouldn't say like, Dad, can we go outside? She'd say just side, side. So that's the idea of like trying to express her intentions with a single word. And you see these like first words anywhere from like under a year. Some kids start talking pretty early, but you see usually by like a year and a half, they're starting to say some words. And then as you see the green thing that represents like this kind of vocabulary jump. And again, these are averages, right? So that's why there's some overlap, and that's why there's going to be differences, and some kids are going to have that vocabulary jump a little bit later. Most kids, again, if they're exposed to stimulating environments where they're getting interaction and they're getting decent nutrition and they're getting attention, they're gonna catch up. So again, one of the big things to remember about psychology is not to worry too much about milestones, but that they are sometimes, they're important to pay attention to, but not overly worry about. Most kids will develop their language by like 3. Okay. So this concept, I just want to keep playing off or keep using that example I was using about my daughter, just because it is still relevant to this concept of what's telegraphic speech, right? So trying to telegraph or show what you're doing. It's like if we're playing basketball and I go to you, go over there, I'm gonna pass to you. And then I go to pass and someone from the other team gets the ball. It's like I totally telegraphed. I said what I was gonna do. So you don't want to do that in sports, but that word means sort of using your, showing what you're doing. And telegraphic speech is sort of like this idea of my baby being using like short words. Like the example I have in my note here is like, Daddy, give ice cream. It's like all those words sort of have an economy to it. There's no filler words. It's like Daddy, that's like who she's talking to. Give means she wants it passed to her, and ice cream is what it is. It's like there's this, I say it's actually like, I thought it was going to be the first point, but it's like 4 down, where I say in every language there's this economy, economical, I meant to say, economical quality to language, meaning that it seems like the first words kids learn, and this sort of makes sense, but it's interesting that this seems to be across languages, are practical words. Like, Daddy, give ice cream. It's like who you want to do it, what you want them to do, and you want it to be ice cream. And so it's that, and this is what the developmental psychologists have found, is that there's this interesting consistency across languages, that the first words kids start to learn tend to always be super practical words. By 18 to 24 months, kids are usually producing 2-word utterances, like what I said earlier of like Daddy, drink, or whatever. That'd be a 2-word utterance, just like 2 words together. And at that point, like my daughter, relying heavily on things like gestures and tone and context, like bringing me into the kitchen and pointing. Idea that those 2 words are often quite succinct, like Daddy, water. It actually like conveys quite a bit of meaning. It means she wants me to basically go and get her. Something's very specific. And what a smart design. It makes sense that the filler words would come later. And so this is kind of like the idea of like what telegraphic speech means. It's speech designed to like be very clearly pass a message. There's less focus on grammar. It's the use of kind of precise short words. Like the example I keep using is like, Daddy, give ice cream. It's very, it telegraphs the intentions. It's very clear. There's not filler, and it's kind of characteristic of a kid starting to talk, starting to throw words together, getting close to talking in sentences. So this is kind of an interesting graphic. This is from the textbook, but just looking at these language milestones, that like crying starts right away. It's like crying happens immediately. It's like basically the first vocalization. Within 2 to 4 months, babies start to make that cooing and like cute baby sounds. By 5 months, they're starting to understand. We think that babies are starting to understand words. By 6 months, they're starting to like babble a bit, and that's kind of interesting that as they're starting to understand words, they almost can't resist trying themselves. 7 to 11 months, they start to get more specific to the language they're being exposed to. 8 to 12 months, they're starting to use gestures, starting to point more. They're starting to display comprehension of words. Like if you ask them to grab the blue toy and they grab a blue toy when there's multiple colored toys, it's like they're starting to, even though they're not talking, they're like showing through their behavior that they're understanding words. Excuse me. 13 months on, again, remember these are like, remember this title of this column is typical age. So it's an average. Typical and average, again, and normal are all similar words. 13 months, first spoken word. 18 months is when this like vocabulary spurt tends to happen. 18 to 24 months. These more use of 2-word utterances, more rapid expansion of understanding more and more words. They're like mental dictionaries growing big time. So again, this is like hard to, it's so interesting I find it interesting anyways to talk about this idea of what it means when it's like to say it's almost like we're pre-designed in a certain way, because there's been this debate or discussion in neuroscience about this idea of, are humans predisposed to learn language? Basically, it's not just like it's still maybe an evolved thing, but it seems like there's actually specific, because the brain still could have evolved in these ways, but there seems to be specific regions that are specifically designed for language, like, and I'm going to talk about these two, the Broca's area and Wernicke's area. So I just want to read this for a sec. Some language scholars view that the remarkable similarities in how children acquire language all over the world may be evidence that language has a biological basis. There's evidence that particular regions in the brain are predisposed to be used for language. 2 regions involved in language were discovered in studies of brain-damaged individuals. So basically what happened is, in scenarios where people got injured in certain areas and how that affected it, is one of the ways people learn that those parts did those things, which is used to be called abnormal psychology. And a lot of the understanding pre-brain scan of what parts of the brain did what were because of like findings from when people got hurt, right? So I didn't describe that super well, but like basically someone gets hurt in a certain part of the brain and you notice that that affects them in a specific way, and you notice that that happens to all kinds of people that get hurt in that way, and then you realize that that part of the brain is associated with that thing, muscular control or whatever it is, language generation. And so the idea is that these 2 parts, one of these parts basically controls your ability to generate the next word you want to say. The other part's like focused on timing and rhythm and appropriateness. So let me just keep going with this, explaining this, right? That the Broca's area, an area in the left frontal lobe of the brain, is more involved in creating words, right? So that's what's shown in that picture as purple. Whereas the Wernicke's area, which is shown there as green, is a region in the brain involved in understanding, right? So like, and understanding context. So it's almost like the part of my brain that's generating the words I'm saying right now is because they're not like completely independent, right? They're like kind of working together right now, and there's like part of my brain that's generating words, and there's part of my brain that's working on making sure I try to make sense. And you know, sometimes it's working better than others. But so there's these 2 regions that are sort of doing different things. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk about how one of the ways we learn this is how they got hurt, like when there's been you know, either through lesions or tumors or disease or acquired brain injury, are sort of the 4 main ways. So there's, if for your notes, if you could have this, that Broca's area is the area of the left frontal lobe of the brain that's involved in producing words, and Wernicke's area is the region of the brain's left hemisphere used for comprehension, so like understanding. So one's for production, one's for understanding. So the idea is that if an individual would have either injury, damage, disease to one of the areas and not the other, that the effect would be different, right? If the if the green area and the purple or pink, whatever area, are doing different things, then you would assume that injury or an issue with one of them, that the issues would be different, right? That so basically damage to either area is called aphasia. It's a loss or impairment of the processing of language. But we find that the Broca's area, if that gets hurt or if that's impaired, there's a difficulty producing speech, but not in comprehension. So that's really frustrating for people, because it's like they know what they want to say, but they struggle saying it. They struggle coming up with the actual words. They know what they mean, but they struggle coming up with the actual words. That's the better way to say it. Whereas, so it's difficulty producing speech, like actually saying, articulating themselves. or just producing words to express what they're thinking. Whereas when there's damage to Wernicke's area, it affects comprehension, and this is definitely in some ways like much worse, because they're theoretically their access to generate speech isn't impaired. They can still talk, but I say they're like, they kind of lose, their speech becomes more nonsensical, right? So it's very difficult, because if you don't understand what you're saying, then you're like by definition sort of not making sense. You're not, you if it, like, how could you possibly talk and make sense if you don't understand what the words you're saying mean? So again, just devastating. Some of those kind of acquired brain injuries are very difficult when they, like, obviously very difficult for the person that it happens to, but also very difficult for the family members and loved ones, like supporting somebody dealing with, because like you realize how vulnerable the head is, and that injuries to certain areas affect people very differently, and some of the ways it can affect is like in how, like, it totally depends where in the brain gets hit. And this is kind of a prime example of that. Yeah, again, back in the day, there used to be classes called abnormal psychology that were super interesting. I don't know if some kind of, if they just call them something different, maybe it's called like that's maybe what's called like neuropsychology, or I'm not sure what they would call it at Nipsing, but those classes are worth taking, because in studying how brain injuries affect processing in general, you learn so much about the kind of how the brain works. So it's interesting, right? Because it seems like obviously part of learning language is this. This again comes back to, I say, biological environmental influences. It's another way of saying nature nurture, which is one of the reasons I spent time in that first presentation going over that. And even though this is the first chapter you're getting quizzed on, I hope you see the value in the first two presentations. Is what I wanted to do is basically also give you like a bit of breathing room, and kind of use the first two presentations to provide the foundation for where we're going to go now, looking at all the different developmental stages. And so, yeah, one of the reasons I spent extra, the reason I got talking about that is I was talking about nature nurture, and how I mentioned in that presentation that we're going to see this come up again and again and again. And this is another look at this. Like, is language is obviously heavily nurture. It's heavily your environment. It's heavily related to what the language you're exposed to from others. But it also seems like we're specifically designed to learn language, and that's the nature side of it. It seems like our ability to speak and understand language, first of all, I say that point that it demands a certain vocal system and nervous system, and that's part of the reason why chimps can't speak. It's not because it's not necessarily a brain power issue, it's a vocal cord issue, and it's the reason why parrots can speak. Yeah, and the fact that, kind of what I was saying before, if like it seems like the Brock's area and the Wernicke's area, which are just people's last names, but it just means specific parts of the brain. It seems like those specifically are related to language. So then if you're like, okay, well, how do we learn language? Well, part of the way we learn language is we're born with a brain ready to learn language, and then we're exposed to language. And that's basically how. And it's way more complicated, but it's also just that. It's nature and nurture. An interesting person in the study of this, and I mentioned Chomsky earlier. And again, he's a complicated person, but in his work on this topic of language is relevant, and his book Manufacturing Consent is an absolute must read. But he's making an argument on the nature side. And he was trying to kind of champion this idea of memes, basically, or this idea that like there's these common cores in all languages, and he almost thought that like the fact that there's these common patterns in all languages means that there's this built-in human ability to learn language. He called this like a language acquisition device. He's like almost like it's like your brain has if your brain was a computer, it has a part that learns language. But the way he said it is, he says that humans are biologically pre-wired to learn language at a certain time and in a certain way. So that's like that sensitive and critical period idea. He said that children are born into the world with a language acquisition device. Again, he's saying it's like not a part of the brain, it's a system, it's a thing the brain does. The brain acquires language if in a situation, if the brain's surrounded by other people and provided nutrition, and basically if a child has a childhood and has stimulation and has interesting things in their world and has exposure to language, it'll learn language. It's just what the brain does. Children are born with a language acquisition ability, a biological endowment, that basically meaning like a genetic inheritance is another way of saying biological endowment, that enables the child to detect the various features and rules of language that a child exposed to language will learn language. And it's amazing. It's like they're born able to learn language. That's kind of his idea. Okay, time for lightning round review. Oh man, I messed up that, but I'm already almost 2.5 minutes in, so I'll try again on the next slide. Welcome to the lightning round review. Basically, I'm just gonna go over some of the main points, right? So that I know that you're gonna be writing a quiz on this chapter. So here, kind of, I'm gonna re-highlight stuff. Remember, we talked about this idea of cephalococcal, or how the baby tends to grows top down, middle out. The idea of physical growth happening rapidly in the first year, slowing down but still significant in the second year. We see dramatic, I'm going to go kind of quick for this, so I called it lightning round. Dramatic changes in characteristics of brain development in the first 2 years. The neurons are born, like so neurogenesis, there's more created, the synapses are formed and then pruned, there's these major structural emergences. We talked about the neuroconstructive view. Or sleep, I made the argument that sleep's correlated or deeply connected with cognitive development. We talked about the idea of reflexes, right? Automatic movements, and how they govern the newborn's behavior, like in how it's so wild that they're these like automatic or not learned. Yeah, what does it mean for a baby to have do something automatically, right? And what reflexes are. We talked about the dynamic system theory, that like the baby's desire to have the candy is part of and learning to reach for the candy. It's like that motivation or that perception of that is food that it wants, and its movement of the arm are like connected. There's this connection between perception and action. We talked about how like gross and fine motor skills. So the baby's learning how to both like gross motor skills, just meaning like big movements like moving your arms and walking. Fine motor skills like holding a pen or doing something that's like more specific, more fine-tuned. We then spent time talking about this idea of sensation, right? And sensation is when information in the outside world interacts with our sense organs. We talked about how we then have interpretations of that sensation, that's called perception. We talked about like visual acuity, depth perception. We talked about how as the kid's getting older, their intermodal perception, this ability to like make sense of their world by combining how the sound and the sight, that's what intermodal means, that perception is sharpening, they're getting better, it's getting stronger, that nature and nurture, so both things affect perceptual development, how we make sense of our world. Sorry, I forgot the lightning part. I'm supposed to be going through these fast. Piaget had the idea that children construct their own cognitive world, building mental structures as they're adapting, right? We talked about this simulation and combination idea. Piaget argued that babies don't understand object permanence, like the peekaboo thing, until like after 9 months. Research now kind of suggests that some babies can do it earlier, but again, that doesn't necessarily disprove the idea that most don't. And this idea of social cognition, or just the understanding of the social world, is developing during infancy. All right. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being a great class, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.